Assassin's Creed Liberation is a limited game. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, a few things. For one, it's limited by its own inception. Originally released as Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, Liberation was conceived and created as a PS Vita tie-in game to act as the sort of companion piece to Assassin's Creed 3, which presents it with the limitations of both hardware and budget. It simply has to be a smaller game than any of the previous titles. These limitations breed more limitations. Liberation is not as bold as it could be, not as ambitious as it could be, and definitely not as big as it would need to be to give the genuinely cool and interesting ideas it has the time they deserve to flourish. It's limited by the franchise truth that it's ultimately just a little spin-off title and can't rock the boat too much. At every turn, Liberation is met with these limitations, and that's ultimately a shame because it's so clear that if those limitations had been lifted, Liberation could have been one of the best games in the series. We don't really get games like Liberation anymore. Spin-off games are pretty rare now considering how expensive games are to make these days. Why would you waste all that money on a spin-off that you know by its very nature is going to make less money than an actual game when you could just make a proper full game? Assassin's Creed used to have a whole bunch of spin-offs every year, mostly phone games that are impossible to find these days, like the Altair Chronicles. And Liberation could have very easily had the same fate, but I think Ubisoft realised that it deserved better than that. It's not very common that a handheld game gets a console release, but they didn't just re-release it, they practically remade the whole game. Redoing all the gameplay, redoing all the graphics, adding a bunch of new stuff to it, bringing it up to the level of, if not a full mainline game, then at least a hefty DLC expansion. This history of starting as a PS Vita exclusive has led to Liberation being one of the most overlooked games in the franchise. If we look at the achievement statistics on Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered, only 10% of players have even started the game. I think just not realising that it is a full separate game on its own right, just in miniature. The game makes a very interesting companion to Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed 3 was all about exploring the dark realities of American history when it comes to the treatment of Native Americans. And Liberation, within its framing, seeks to do the same thing for another dark side of American history, the history of slavery. Rooted in its own new perspective, Aveline de Grand Prix, a French African woman living in New Orleans during the time of the American Revolution. In some ways, Aveline is an even more daring protagonist than Connor was because she is still to this day one of the only female protagonists in the series, and the only one with no qualifiers on that statement. There is no male protagonist to balance things out, there is no character select screen to give people an opt-out. The story of Liberation is Aveline's from start to finish, and that is one of its strongest aspects. In 2012, forget it, it was rare to have a woman protagonist, a black woman protagonist. I don't know if I can name 10 games today that have a black woman protagonist. And none other than Liberation that are set in a historical period as hostile to black people as the 18th century. The game got a little bit of backlash for not being realistic, because apparently a woman like Aveline could never have existed, I guess, but not nearly as much of that as you would expect. Liberations just predates Gamergate, the time when that politics in our video games rhetoric hit its full stride, but I think the main reason is that it's just a spin-off game that few people played, so it flew under the radar. However, Aveline hasn't hit the Ellen Ripley point like Connor has, where people feel comfortable using her as an example of back when games weren't political. And I think that's because there's simply no way to play Liberation without engaging with it on a political level. Aveline's identity as a mixed-race woman isn't just important to the story, it's the core gameplay mechanic that the entire game is built around. Liberation is not like an amazing game or anything, but it is a very interesting game that could have been amazing with the proper scope and budget, with all of the limitations around its creation removed. So, without further ado, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Liberation.
Connect with the past. Relive history. Using Abstergo's incredible research into genetic memory, Animus gives you the chance to game within the past. The product you have purchased allows you to access the memories of Aveline de Grand Prix, an 18th century assassin caught between two worlds, fighting to find her true purpose. Make history yours. History is our playground.
Liberation Liberation doesn't feature a modern-day protagonist, but there is still a modern-day aspect to the game baked into the foundations, and it's all getting very meta. Liberation is, within the framing of the story, a video game that has been made by Abstergo Entertainment, the new gaming branch of the Templars, having now expanded the Animus technology so that memories can be relived by people other than the original person's ancestor. This meta game within a game framing is more important than you might think, because it means that you're playing through a piece of in-universe Templar propaganda. Abstergo are not just presenting the history neutrally, they chose Aveline for a reason and have made certain edits to reality to better align with the message they're trying to convey. Luckily, your copy of the game has been hacked by Erudito, a hacking group that's shown up in the background of a few games, and they've re-edited back in the real history for you, but only if you go looking for it. Why would the Templars use an assassin, their hated rival, as the face of their propaganda? The answer is quite simple. Optics. Aveline was a woman who fought against societal expectations and depression to spend her life freeing slaves. It would be impossible to make her look like a villain, so they don't. They co-opt her instead. They make careful edits to her story to suggest that even though she's an assassin, actually she represents all the values they espouse. They've carefully edited out all mention of the Templar Order specifically, but they still want Aveline to be the face of their organisation. Already, this is a deeply politically charged thing to tackle, especially for a black historical figure. Look no further than how conservative politicians love to quote and call back to Martin Luther King Jr. and twist his words to fit their own narratives, despite the fact that the man himself was openly socialist in his politics. It's often said that history is written by the victor, but I think it's more true to say that history is written by the guy with the biggest microphone. MLK's reality doesn't matter as much as his usefulness as a rhetorical tool. The same thing is true of a lot of historical figures, particularly black historical figures, because it allows for a veneer of progressiveness. That if you squint, really MLK's vision of a colourblind world is exactly the same as fighting against affirmative action policies. The Templars don't care about real history, they care about power and control. Aveline is exactly the kind of folk hero that makes for a good shield to hide behind. We have a term for that, a term that's been thoroughly beaten into the ground to the point where it's lost all meaning, but that still actually applies here: virtue signalling. The meta element comes from the fact that in some respects, this is clearly Ubisoft taking a couple potshots at themselves. The line in the opening about making history your playground is a direct callback to the marketing of the original Assassin's Creed. It's good marketing speak, but it takes only the slightest shift in context to make it sinister. Making history your playground can also mean changing history, playing around with it to suit your whims, and that is on some level what all the Assassin's Creed games do. There are two kinds of edits Abstergo have made to Aveline's story. One is to remove the mentions of Templars, but the other is to sand off the dark corners of history to make their product more consumer-friendly, removing mentions of masters torturing slaves for trying to escape, or what's probably the most interesting one in the game, a moment with Aveline's father on his deathbed. Abstergo cut out a little moment where, thinking that Aveline was her mother, her father is filled with regret that he was unable to marry her because interracial marriage is illegal. That doesn't have anything to do with the Assassins or Templars, it's just an uncomfortable truth of history that might make you feel sad to think about. Abstergo wants a fun game where you free lots of slaves and feel good about yourself for doing it. It doesn't want you to think about the underlying systemic issues or the dark and depressing details of chattel slavery. You might recall that this was pretty much exactly my critique of Assassin's Creed 2, that it sanitises history in the name of player comfort and fun. Ubisoft's willingness to paint themselves as the villain, at least in some respects, is very interesting, especially in retrospect. Both in terms of what we now know to be true about the internal situation of Ubisoft, and in terms of the way they've tried to pivot their brand to apolitical games, the very thing they are here painting as evil. This is all genuinely interesting stuff to include in the game, but it does come at a cost, which is that when you present the story in a deliberately hollow and defanged way, the story appears hollow and defanged. This method of only seeing the true story after the fact makes the experience of playing through the story a bit weird, because you're supposed to be second-guessing everything you're being shown, and the person most affected by that is Aveline herself. As the lady in the introduction told us, Aveline is a woman caught between two worlds, a truth that is baked into the core of her identity as a biracial woman. Her mother was a slave and her father was her owner, a wealthy French merchant and nobleman. But Liberation, much like Assassin's Creed 3, refuses to paint in black and white. Everything is shades of grey. Despite being a slave owner, Philippe de Grandpré is a kind and loving man. He did buy his wife and daughter's freedom after Aveline was born, and he seems to genuinely love his daughter. But that doesn't mean he's not still a wealthy white slave owner. Aveline's mother's journal makes absolutely no mention of what Philippe did with all of his other slaves that he wasn't in love with, so we could assume the answer was nothing. Because of her status as the recognised daughter of a nobleman, Aveline was born into a place of massive privilege that simply isn't afforded to the vast majority of black people in the era. She grew up in the lap of luxury, taught to read and write, proper etiquette, even fancy-pantsy piano lessons. This presents a pretty drastic contrast to Connor. Connor fights for a culture and a people that he was born into and raised in. Like Aveline, he's also mixed race, but he doesn't have the same split between race and identity. He is fully Mohawk, he just happens to have a white dad. Aveline was raised in a distinctly white way. She speaks with a French accent and carries herself with the bearing of a noblewoman. And the result is that she's an outsider to both her mother's and father's culture. There's an old trope here that at first glance Aveline might appear to slot neatly into, and by old trope I mean like Victorian. The tragic mulatto. A half-black, half-white person, though usually a woman, who aspires to be seen as white and accepted by white society, but simply cannot because she was born with black blood. Thus, the tragedy. You can tell this is a Victorian-era trope, right? You can already picture the big frilly dresses and the fainting couches. The racism of the trope should be apparent. It predisposes that white culture is superior to black culture, and being unable to experience it is the ultimate tragedy that could befall someone. That the tragedy of being born mixed race specifically comes from the black side of things. Aveline is a subversion of the trope by the very basic construction that she's not to be viewed as pitiful, but also because she's not at all characterised as having a yearning to be accepted by white culture. At least, not in the real version of the story. In fact, what comes most strongly across from Aveline is a refusal to let either her father's or her mother's history define who she is. She's neither a noblewoman or a slave. She's an assassin. This split in her identity makes up the core mechanic of the game, the persona system. There are 3 personas that Aveline can adopt for dealing with different situations. The lady, the slave, and the assassin. 3 different social roles with different strengths and limitations. The lady is obviously the least combat focused, being that Aveline is wearing a fancy elaborate dress with no weapons. Moreover, she can't even run and climb while wearing it, severely limiting your mobility. But it also gives you the most social freedom. You can bribe guards to access restricted areas and charm certain men to lead them to a secluded area and slit their throat. The slave is able to carry some simple weapons, but still isn't the strongest in a fight because she's just wearing simple clothes. However, this disguises the lowest profile and allows you to enter plantations and the like by blending in with the slaves. And finally, the assassin persona has access to all of Aveline's tools and equipment, as well as a much bigger health bar and a special chain kill move, but the downside is that it's extremely conspicuous. It was a bit of a social faux pas in the 1700s for a woman to be wearing trousers, let alone being absolutely covered in weapons, so your notoriety as an assassin will never be 0. You have to stick to the rooftops and the side alleys. This system is brilliant, and it's a crime that Liberation is the only game in the series to actually utilise it. It's the only thing in the series that really properly engages with social stealth as a game design feature beyond blending in with crowds. But it's also a system so clearly driven from who Aveline is and what tools she has at her disposal as a mixed-race woman in her time and place. NPCs have different callouts depending on your persona. The lady persona will get mugged if you walk down the wrong alley, and the notoriety system has been fine-tuned to make it feel mechanically tied with each specific persona. The 3 methods of clearing notoriety carry over from previous games, but they're split between each of the 3 personas. So, for example, the slave gains notoriety the fastest, being that as a slave there's a certain level of extra scrutiny on you for everything you do outside of what you're supposed to be doing. But it also gets the posters, by far the easiest method for clearing notoriety, because as a slave, someone considered less than human, you are basically invisible to a common white man. On the opposite end, the lady gains notoriety the slowest because people would never suspect a fine young lady such as Aveline de Grandpré could be capable of all that. But it's also the hardest to clear because you have to kill witnesses, which can gain you as much notoriety as it clears if you're not careful. This mechanic would not work for Ezio or Altair or Connor. They don't have access to these different worlds the way that Aveline and her unique place in history does. This is the flip side of diversity in games that often goes overlooked. It's not just about making your character a black woman or whatever, it's about translating what that means into every aspect of the game, not just the story. Each persona heavily informs Aveline's character because it becomes quickly apparent that the lady persona, the big-eyed doting daddy's girl, is obviously an act, and the slave persona is just a disguise. The real Aveline is the assassin, the one transgressing all the social norms to run around and stab slave owners. Aveline may be caught between two worlds, but her solution isn't to try and adapt to either of them. It's to use both of them as tools while fighting to create a better world where she doesn't have to choose. That's the story Liberation tells through its mechanics, and it's a damn good one. The problem is really when we get into the actual script. Liberation's problem isn't so much in the quality of the writing as much as it's in the amount of writing. Liberation is trying to tell a story as equally impactful and wide-scoped as Assassin's Creed 3 in a quarter of the runtime. Even being completionist, Liberation barely crosses 8 hours, which, in combination with some of the other factors we've discussed, causes a pretty major issue. We have a story which is already short, combined with a story that's cutting out important bits for narrative effect, combined with a story where the main character spends at least half of her time in disguise. And the combination of all of these things leads to a main story experience that's really hard to actually get invested in because nothing gets the time it needs to breathe. The story is absolutely full of things that, if given more time to develop, could be really interesting, but they're gone almost as soon as they're introduced. Aveline meets most of her assassination targets in the same mission that she kills them, so there's not really any time to characterise them and get to know their motivations beyond the most surface level stuff. The game's setting of New Orleans is an interesting pick, specifically because it's a version of colonial America that we don't really see much in pop culture. New Orleans was a French colony that at this point in time was actually owned by the Spanish. But either way, it didn't have any involvement in the American Revolution. Louisiana is not one of the original 13 states. It was purchased by the American government in 1803. It also just creates a nice visual contrast from AC3. Instead of the woods of upstate New York, we have the Louisiana Bayou. But the story never really does much with its setting beyond that kind of set dressing. There's some mention at one point by the upper class that war could be good for business, but overall the revolution up north has seemingly no effect on the denizens of New Orleans at all, and especially not on Aveline herself. Sequence 8 takes Aveline on a journey up to New York on the hunt for a target where she meets up with Connor for a little crossover mission. You can even replay the mission from Connor's perspective if you want. As a player character, Connor is way more developed than pretty much any other NPC in the game, but unfortunately it's a crossover without any real substance. The fun of a crossover is having your two characters interact and bounce off each other. This was exactly what made the missions with Hatham in the third game so fun. But with only a single mission, the two of them just kind of maintain a formal working relationship for the entirety of the mission and then it's over. The mission is set during a period where both of them are having doubts about the Assassin Order and how much good it can actually do for their respective peoples. But really the only way that's addressed is with a little lip service.
Connor, are you always certain in the means and ways of the Brotherhood?
I trust my own hands.
Of course.
Travel safely.
It's the arrival that concerns me.
Then you are on the right path.
That little interaction could make for the foundation of an entire chapter of the story, where even if the two of them have doubts about their respective mentors, they form a connection based on their own actions and own resolve and learn to rely on one another as the new generation who are rebuilding the Order from the ground up. But that would be way beyond the scope of this little spin-off game, and so all we get is a single mission. Most unfortunately, the same issue has a big impact on the game's depiction of slavery. Just because of the constraints of the game, none of the slaves you rescue or free become fully developed characters. They end up feeling more like vignettes than anything else. You rescue one lady who wants to start a revolution, one guy who wants to return to Africa, one guy ends up joining the Templars because they offer him a kind of power he won't have anywhere else. That one-sentence description is the whole of each of these characters. Like Connor, each of these people and their perspectives could make up an entire chapter of the story, but instead they're just one-and-done parts of the story with no room to explore any of these ideas they bring up in more detail. Ultimately, the only thing you can really take away from Liberation is that slavery is bad, which, you know, it is, but Assassin's Creed 3 was able to get a lot more specific with its depiction of Native Americans and their place in the foundation of America than Liberation is with its depiction of African Americans. Slavery as a concept is presented kind of abstractly. It's a thing that's happening and it's bad, but any kind of systemic issues, human issues, or most importantly the way that institutional slavery and the foundations of America are completely intertwined, are just not explored in any meaningful way. There are two causes of this issue. One is the game's numerous limitations. The game just doesn't have enough time to get into more detail on this stuff. But the second issue is Aveline and the way the game frames her. Despite starring the series' first female protagonist, the game is shockingly tame when it comes to presenting any kind of sexism. I'm not asking for total historical accuracy here. The treatment of women slaves versus the men was different in a lot of ways, and some of those ways would not make for a very good video game. Let's just leave it at that. There is a point that comes up much later in the game after Aveline's father's death, which is that as a daughter born out of marriage, Aveline is entitled to absolutely no inheritance. She doesn't get the house or the business. Were it not for the generosity of her white stepmother and bestest soft boy Gerald, she would be out on the street. But she does have that generosity, so it doesn't become an actual problem in the story. Running your father's trade business is a game mechanic after all. The game is really unwilling to make Aveline a victim in any way, which on the one hand is not a terrible thing, because as a video game, player empowerment takes center stage, and I won't pretend that the imagery of a black woman murdering slave owners with their own whip isn't extremely charged in a Django Unchained sort of way. On the other hand, isn't this softening of history exactly what the game is calling out as inherently sinister? The game is willing to show conversations about darker topics, but conversations is where it draws the line. It's still defining itself in a lot of ways and presenting a more sanitized version of history while calling itself out for doing that. Aveline's position as a badass warrior who operates completely outside of the law kind of places her above the concerns of racism and sexism, because it's obvious that those things just don't really work on her. She can kill 100 men with her bare hands, nobody's going to be abusing her anytime soon. And unlike Connor, Aveline is not defined by naivety. She knows damn well her precarious position, and she turns it to her advantage with the persona system. Our first scene with Aveline is her walking the streets with her mum before she gets separated and ends up in front of a slave auction where one of the guards threatens to kill her for looking at him funny. Aveline has known since she was very young that her position in the nobility is always one wrong turn away from being completely irrelevant, but she's learned to walk that fine line and even thrive within its limitations. Aveline lives in a deeply sexist and racist world, but she's made herself immune to those things before the game begins. So racism and sexism is something that affects other people in the story a great deal, but not really Aveline herself. That's not inherently an issue, the same thing basically applies to Connor, but the difference is in the framing of the story. Assassin's Creed 3 is a tragedy built on historical futility. You know going in that Connor will not win, that his efforts will be in vain, and his people are doomed to a future of persecution and genocide. It lets the game be a massive downer, but that gives it significant importance and impact. Liberation does not do this. The same foreknowledge applies. We know that Aveline de Grand Prix didn't end slavery, that no matter how many slaves she frees and slavers she kills, institutional slavery will only increase in its cruelty and cultural dominance over the next century. But Liberation doesn't want you to think about that. It wants to be empowering in a more traditional video gamey way. The liberation of the title doesn't actually refer to slaves, or at least it doesn't exclusively refer to that. It refers to Aveline's personal story arc. Aveline's deal in the game is about learning to question suspicious authority. Her assassin mentor, Agati, is a shady, bitter fellow, much more bristly than even Achilles, and it becomes clear as the story goes on that he cares less about the actual philosophy of the assassins, as he does getting revenge for the past wrongs done against him personally. He's a man with deep trust issues rooted in a long history of betrayals, including by Aveline's mother, who he was once in love with. And he often takes out those pent-up frustrations on Aveline, who he views as a daughter that was stolen from him. This is probably another reason that Abstergo chose Aveline in the first place. With Agati as an authority figure, it's pretty easy to paint the assassins as extremist terrorists instead of freedom fighters. These constant clashes with Agati is what causes Aveline to start questioning the Assassin Brotherhood, and in Abstergo's version of the story what eventually drives her to join the Templar Order, under the secret Grandmaster, her own stepmother. But the truth is, Madeline is an equally suspicious figure of authority. She manipulated Aveline's real mother into going into hiding and then spent years trying to groom Aveline into the Order. She's a manipulator whose solution to the slavery issue is to do more of it on a much larger scale, just the kind of slavery that's a prison of the mind instead of the body. So in the end, what Aveline needs to do is liberate herself, free herself from both of these authority figures and forge her own path ahead. That's the note the game ends on. It's the total tonal opposite of Assassin's Creed 3's depressing gut punch of an ending. It's a victorious ending. You killed all the bad guys and won. That just doesn't feel very true to history. This lack of connection between historical reality and the story of the game also unfortunately makes Aveline come across as a much weaker character than Connor. She feels a lot more generic in her personality. She's brave and noble and doesn't take shit from anyone. I pretty much just described every game protagonist ever. That, again, is probably a consequence of the game's short runtime, coupled with the fact that she spends half the game acting as different personas that aren't actually her real personality. She simply doesn't get enough time to flourish. But the result of all these different factors combined, the narrative framing, the short runtime, the lack of fleshed out NPCs, the lack of depth to Aveline, they all lead to an ultimately shallow experience of a game. You can quite easily blaze through the whole thing without feeling a single emotion, and that's a damn shame. There's a rumour circulating right now that Ubisoft are working on a remake of Black Flag, and that makes sense. Black Flag is a fan favourite and a remake will probably sell pretty well. But at the same time, that doesn't make any sense at all. Black Flag was, and still is, a good game that did exactly what it was trying to do. The games we should be remaking are the games like Liberation, the games with so much potential and so much to expand on that never quite got there because of their limitations. Aveline is a pioneer among game protagonists, and she deserves a full game that properly recognises that. Liberation feels like a proof of concept, a vertical slice of a full game that could be just as big and impactful as Assassin's Creed 3 if it was just given time to breathe and removed of all of those limitations. That will probably never happen, unfortunately, and so we're left with Assassin's Creed Liberation, a game with lots of limitations on it that it will never escape from, leading to a reputation of it as a game that is fine. And that's a very whatever note to end on, but I guess that's what I'm stuck with.
Eve will lead us through the war of generations.
There will be great sacrifice, great sorrow to end the enslavement of the human race.
Now is the time to claim our freedom. Are you with us?
I am.
Eve will lead us.
Eve will lead us.
It is done.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. This time, I'd especially like to thank Ryan Hammond, who just upgraded to my $20 tier. Thank you so much, mate. You've been around for a long time, and that means a lot to me, but it means even more to me now, because now you get to sparkle. And if you'd like to join Ryan, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me, as well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. For whom does the bell toll? Me, I guess. To see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click up here, or maybe I'll just link Revelations again, because it's still not doing so well in the old algorithm. So maybe go show old Ezio some kindness. I sure didn't.